Because he was so avoidant and honestly emotionally unavailable, I stayed in the relationship because that is what I saw as safety, not realizing at the time that there was no hope for it and that he was never going to be able to meet my needs. So as I stayed in that relationship, it mirrored back to me my deepest needs because that relationship so mirrored the relationship with my caregivers that I thought it was normal and I thought it was what love was. So he mirrored back to me my deepest needs from a very core origin story. And because he refused to meet those needs along the way, I had to dig deep and meet them myself because walking away from the relationship at the time was not an option. I had gotten so attached in the trauma bond and so disoriented because so many of my triggers were being activated all at once that to stay with him was a form of safety. Because even though it was bad treatment, at least it was something that was familiar and that I knew. To break up with him at that stage and go out and be single and be triggered was not something that I could handle at the time. So I stayed with him. And what that did was made me solely responsible for meeting my emotional needs. So here's an example. I would be triggered by something that he did, purposefully or non-purposefully. Let's say he left me on red for a long period of time. That was a big trigger for me. That triggered an abandonment wound. And so I would express to him in some subtle way, not always overtly, because at that point I was playing very, very small to keep love. He had communicated to me that I had to play small to keep love. And so as I did as a child, I was playing small in the relationship. So sometimes I would express my need and other times I wouldn't. What happened more often than not is when I would express the need, it would be ignored, dismissed, or gaslit. Now this was something I was used to because it so mirrored my original relationships that I didn't even think twice. I didn't even have a name for it. I didn't understand what was happening. But I was in such a triggered state, and he communicated to me that he was not going to meet my need. And he communicated this to me over and over and over again. And so I had nothing left to do but turn inward and give it to myself, because it was the first time that all the other things I had used to cope with being triggered, alcohol or distraction or shopping or whatever, none of those things worked because I was so triggered on such a core level. And I was grasping so tightly to being chosen by him and keeping that safety of the relationship that to leave him was not an option. So I had to stay in the relationship where my needs were not met. All the other outside things that used to help me and comfort me were no longer working. So now I was left to comfort myself. And here is the answer to this question. And ultimately, like the greatest transformation that I've ever gone through. Because I started to have to go inward and look at the trigger and ask myself what was happening. Because I was being faced with the littlest part of myself. Like the inner child that had been ignored for so long and covered up and told to keep quiet was actually the one that was kind of running the show. And she kept coming up in this relationship. Like she was so triggered over and over again that I started to get curious about her and get to know her. So I started to discover baseline what it felt like in my body. And when she's triggered, my stomach hurts. I can't breathe often. I feel panicky. I feel very fearful. I feel very teary, like I can cry easily. So it was like first being aware of how it felt in my body when she was triggered. And then I had help from a therapist because I was seeing a therapist during the relationship. At first I started doing that because I thought, oh, I need to like get this in check, this needy part of me, so that it can stop showing up in my relationship and I can hold on to my relationship. Because again, that was like my main goal, was to stay in the relationship and morph myself to be more amenable and to be easier for him so that he would continue to pick me and choose me. But as I was with her in therapy, she really helped me to go inward and get to know that inner child and start asking her questions. So I had to go to a really quiet inward place and really connect with her. So I had to, this is gonna sound crazy, but I had to like offer her a little gift. When I was a little girl, I had a blanket that my aunt had made me. It was a Holly Hobby blanket. and I loved it. I used to rub the corner of it up against my face, and I would touch it with my thumb and my finger and kind of twirl it in between when I was needing comfort. And so I would imagine that blanket, and I would imagine myself giving it to her. And then she would come forward. It was like I had to offer her a symbol that I was safe and that I was no longer trying to keep her quiet, and I was no longer trying to shut her up, but I was gonna listen to her. And so then I would ask her, what do you need right now? What are you feeling? Just talk to me, I'm here. And she would often just express really childlike fears of abandonment, of being scared, of needing comfort. And I would just often listen. I would just listen. And then I realized that through therapy, like I needed to start comforting her, because what our inner children want more than anything is the adult version of us to assure them that they're going to be safe. Because she was never comforted by the caregivers that were supposed to comfort her. And so now you're living your whole adult life with this little child in you that has not ever been comforted, and so that little child acts out. And so it's our job as adults to comfort that little inner child and to finally tell her that we are going to protect her and we are going to keep her safe. So that was what my therapist kind of led me through, was basically reassuring her and telling her that we're going to keep the safe space for you. So after doing that many times, because I was so triggered in this relationship over and over again, I started to realize that beyond just hearing her and acknowledging her needs and comforting her, I had to take action behind making a safe place for her. And that meant looking around at the relationships that I had and really looking at them under a microscope and saying, is this a safe place for her? Like, does this person show up for me? Does this person know about her? Does this person actively try to trigger her to maintain power and control? And I realized the answer to that last question in relation to my relationship was yes. So then that led me down a whole path of, is this person not only emotionally immature, but perhaps narcissistic and or toxic? Because when somebody is utilizing your deepest fears and triggers to maintain power and control and emotionally manipulate you, that is a toxic person at the minimum and a narcissist at the maximum. So the more I learned about it, the more I realized, oh, this person is extremely unsafe. And I eventually had the courage to walk away. And I've had to do that in many relationships of mine. What I didn't realize is, because that inner child wasn't being heard most of my life, I had attracted a lot of relationships in my life, friendships, family relationships, love relationships, that mirrored that original dynamic that used to make me safe. That toxic, manipulative, user type of relationship. I had a lot of relationships like that in my life because the inner child was not being heard, and that was what was safety to me, because again, those mimic the earliest origin relationships. So I had to be really clear on what made me feel safe in a relationship, and if those loved ones couldn't meet those needs and give me those things, then I distanced myself from them, and I am still on that path of doing that. So that is a very long-winded question as to how a relationship can actually be toxic and very hurtful, but at the same time, the catalyst for your greatest growth. It is quite a paradox, but listen to yourself and you will naturally always undertake your own healing as long as you're listening to yourself, and you will know every step to take along the way towards your ultimate healing. And it's a never-ending process. We go on and on healing until we die, but this relationship triggered me so much that it ultimately led me out of anxious attachment and into secure attachment. Because secure attachment is, I can meet my own needs first, and anybody that's in my life mirrors what I already give to myself.